So to kick us off on the main stage today to discuss who trains the auditors of tomorrow is the closest thing you can get to a rock star in the world of audit. The Young Accountant of the Year 2025 and Audit Data Analytics Director at RSM UK, we have Konrad Bukowski-Krujina. Please welcome him on stage. I hope I got that pronunciation right, Konrad.
Thanks, Moosh. Fair warning to everyone, he's introduced me as a rock star. The guitars have been left at home for very good reason, because nobody needs to hear any of that. Particularly as my wife describes my choice of music as complicated noise, which is progressive rock, for those of you interested. But there you go, already some groans. That's me. I won't dwell too much on myself, given Moosh's introduction, but just a brief overview of the offering within RSM in terms of audit data analytics, just to provide some context to this session and why I'm up here on stage with you lovely people. So audit data analytics is a function that I founded back in 2018 within the firm. It's grown from a team of yours truly to, I think, 43 people at the moment at last count. And we are split into 4 streams, if you will. We have a bespoke work stream, that primarily works with our larger, more complex clients, pretty much with a sky's the limit sort of mentality in terms of what audit teams want to do. We have an app development team that originally started out taking a lot of the repeat workflows that the bespoke team were doing, productionizes them, and enables auditors to self-serve. So we're at around about 250,000 app runs a year across all of our audit engagements nationally with that team. We've then got a data ingestion team who, as the name suggests, focus on helping our audit teams get client data out of their accounting systems into a standardized common format. And last but certainly not least, we've got our AI and automation team. And I'm pretty sure all the sessions here will give you a good idea as to what it is that they do. So with that, most important things, because there are CPE credits available for this session. Those of you who are logging those, if you could just take some time, get your mobile phones out, scan that QR code so that you can track those. I understand that yesterday some of the speakers went a little bit quickly through this, so I will try to give you the appropriate amount of time before moving on here. Right. Looks like most of the phones have made their way through. So again, because this is a wonderful CPD session, we have some learning objectives for everyone here. So 4 of them. So number 1, by the end of this session, you should be able to identify the developmental blind spot in your AI implementation strategy. Number 2, you'll hopefully be able to explain the implications of the Level 7 funding change for your training economics. 3, you'll be able to evaluate the structural risks of the pyramid to diamond model. Slight spoiler, some stuff coming up. And then finally, hopefully you'll be able to apply a framework to assess whether your AI strategy addresses talent development. So, these things I always think are a little bit better with a bit of interaction, and whilst we don't have sort of Slido, we're going to go back to the old-fashioned show of hands. So, I'm going to pose a quick question, and I'll give you 4 potential answers here. So the question, as you can see on screen, is, does your firm's AI strategy have a talent development chapter? And I'll give you 1 of 4 options. Option 1, yes, and it's fully developed. Thank you very much, Konrad. No idea why I'm here. I'll leave now and move to another session. Option 2, yes, but it's a work in progress. Option 3 is no, but it's on the agenda, I promise. And option 4, no, I'll be honest, I haven't thought about it, and I don't think anyone else has. So we'll start positively. Who wants to go for option 1, yes, and it's fully developed? Ah, disappointing, I don't have anyone to come here and take my place. Okay, option 2, yes, and it's a work in progress. Oh, a few tentative hands, that's good. That's what I like to see. Nothing from John, that's disappointing, John. Option 3, no, but it's on the agenda. There we go. And then finally, no, I'll be honest and I haven't thought about it. Michael, really? Very disappointing from you there. Okay, so keep those things in mind as we go through the session. So, before we really dive into the nitty-gritty of things, I want to start off with a word, and that word is audit. And it's what most of us in this room either do for a living or are very close to people who do it for a living. Now, those of you who know me know that I love Latin and the ancient word, and so, of course, the root of the word audit comes from the Latin audio, which is fourth conjugation, audio, audire, audivi, auditum, obviously. Apologies to those with PTSD from their Latin days, and it means I hear. So from that, we can surmise that an auditor is one who listens. It's somebody who listens with intent. They apply judgment, and they should determine whether what they hear is consistent with the evidence that's being presented to them. That very rough definition of audit and what an auditor does hasn't really changed in about 2,000 years. But what has changed is what we're increasingly asking our junior auditors to do on a day-to-day basis. And there's something in there about what most firms are removing from the formation of those junior auditors without necessarily noticing it. And that's really what I want to spend the next 35, 40 minutes going through. So, because we're a room full of accountants, we like numbers, so I found some numbers. So the scale of what's happening in the wider profession isn't necessarily always visible to those of us within the profession and within our own individual firms. So Bloomberg tax analysis of Bureau of Labour Statistics data shows that there's been a 17% decline in the US accounting and auditing workforce from a peak in 2019, which equates to about 300,000 people, or slightly more than 300,000 people. Some quite stark figures, and anyone who's ever conversed with sort of US colleagues is probably familiar with the sort of brain drain, talent drain that's going on in the States. But of course, I hear you all cry, Konrad, we're here in the UK today, we work primarily across European firms, you know, the Americans can do their own thing, it's a different market, different landscape, fine. I don't have European figures, but I have managed to get a sense of the UK picture from the FRC. So the FRC publishes what they call a key facts and trends document. Annoyingly, the most recent one is from 2025. And I've got a few stats up there from that on screen. So they showed a second consecutive year of falling student numbers, with 100 fewer people gaining the audit qualification in 2024 compared to 2023. And the audit qualification is one of those prerequisites for ultimately signing your life away at the bottom of an audit report. So again, you know, not quite as drastic as some of those US figures, but numbers don't look to be in a healthy place. There was a recent Financial Times article in March earlier this year with the very reasonable headline of Accountancy's Partnership Pipeline Risks Running Dry. The article itself isn't as hysterical as the title suggests, and it's actually well worth the read if you do get some time. But there is something that, you know, the data alone doesn't capture. And this is where I want to introduce myself properly, because my own story, I think, is part of the argument here. So, as I hinted, I didn't always want to be an accountant. Throughout much of my school career, I wanted to be a lawyer. And not just any lawyer, I wanted to be a barrister. I wanted to be up there in court, in the black gown with the horsehair wig, absolutely loved the theatrics of it. But one thing led to another, and I thought, actually, I don't want to do that. I changed my mind, spent a year working, and then did the only sensible thing that anyone in my position could do, and thought, you know what? I'm going to do a master's in classical studies and really get into ancient history, Latin and ancient Greek, with a bit of Phoenician on the side, because I'm that cool. Unsurprisingly, there are very few career opportunities for someone with an MA in classics. And so I thought, well, I don't really want to get into academia, I don't really want to get into teaching, which my wife reminds me on a regular basis that is probably a good thing for everyone, and she is a teacher. So I thought, well, numbers always came easily to me, I quite enjoyed math, so let's have a look at this accountancy lark. So opening up graduate recruitment pages and saw this sort of audit and auditor role, seemed to have loads of openings absolutely everywhere, so I thought, great, we'll give that thing a go. And you know, when I started applying for those graduate schemes, and even arguably when I started day one at what is now RSM, I had no idea what an auditor was or what auditors did. So frankly, it's a miracle that I'm here in front of you today. But I think that story, or some sort of semblance of that story, is probably more common than a lot of firms acknowledge. You know, a lot of people arrive into the profession via a side door, they discover that they're good at it, and they stay. And I think that's an interesting piece, because firms don't just train their own people. They train the wider economy's CFOs, FDs, audit committee members, because there's always been this understanding that, you know, after the 3-year ACA training contract, there is very high attrition. And that's always been accepted as just part and parcel of doing business. You know, the pipeline was historically healthy, and actually having those alumni going out into the wider economy, into the wider world, you know, brought benefits with it coming back into the firm with those networks that we, you know, develop and maintain over time. And so I think all of the sort of AI doom narrative and all of this hysteria that you see on LinkedIn in the wider press ultimately is working to close a lot of those entryways for a lot of these junior people thinking about a career in the profession. You know, I had no idea what an auditor did when I was leaving university. You know, think about the average 18-year-old school leaver or the 21-year-old graduate. You know, if all they're really seeing is that, oh, AI is coming for your jobs, it's going to automate everything into oblivion, your only logical response really is to think, well, I'm not going to apply for one of these jobs that potentially has a shelf life of 2-3 years, depending on who you believe. I'll go off and be a plumber or a builder. And some people might say that's probably a better use of our time in this country, at least, with the house building crisis that we've got. But this isn't my political soapbox, so I'll be quiet. So ultimately, that leads me to, you know, this particular quote here, that the people who are deterred before they start leave no trace. Sort of that age-old, you know, completeness issue of how do you test what's not there. So, this is the part where, in the original version of this, we'd have had a lovely Slido word cloud, and instead we're going to try to do a bit of a roving mic session and see how well this works. But, you know, I've got a question up there, just to sort of get a feel from the room. You know, what is the biggest barrier that you're finding in your firms of actually bringing in the next generation to your firm? And it doesn't have to be 1 or 2 words. I'm more than happy for people to just throw out any thoughts that they have. Anyone willing to throw out some ideas? Absolutely nothing. Gosh. Perfect. Gentleman in the front here.
Hello.
You won't hear it because it's in headsets.
Oh, I see.
Just speak loudly for me and everyone will hear you through the headset.
Well, actually, just to be contrary, I am not finding at the moment a big barrier to recruitment. I think 2 years ago it was a very, very different story, but right now a lot of people are knocking at my door. That's my experience.
Fantastic.
I don't know. I've no idea why.
See, that's the interesting thing then, that you've got no idea why. Interesting, very interesting. So when I've sort of posed this question to a few other people, I tend to get some of the usual answers around, you know, the concept of pay, that people think that sort of the world of accountancy sort of pays at lower levels compared to other professional services. Inevitably, the talk of AI and automation comes up. And I think somewhat unfairly, some people throw out the idea that accountancy isn't necessarily seen as a particularly exciting or, dare I say, sexy profession, which doesn't help with getting people through the front door. But glad to hear that not everyone's seeing some of these issues. So, yeah, great to hear on that front. So, if we think about you know, what an audit is and the sorts of things that we ask our auditors to do, I'm going to try to break down sort of audit tasks into 2 relatively simplistic layers. We've got a mechanical layer and an analytical layer. So the mechanical layer is the one where we ask auditors to see, well, you know, does the date on the invoice match what we've got in the general ledger? Are the board minutes complete? Does the confirmation balance reconcile to what we've got on the trial balance and the accounting records? That's the layer that to a lot of people outside the profession looks like work, it fills audit files, and that's the stuff that, generally speaking, can be automated to a greater or lesser extent. The second layer that either sits alongside it or is interwoven within it, depending on your viewpoint, is the analytical layer. And that's where we think about, well, what assertion are we actually worried about here? What would a discrepancy that we uncover mean not just for this particular line item, but for the audit opinion as a whole? What does this reveal about how the business is run, when you're thinking about board minutes? And I would say that, the developmental value of junior staff has always lived in that analytical layer. I have yet to come across someone who, freely has told me, oh, I got into auditing for the love of ticking and bashing my way through invoices. That's really what gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm sure somewhere there are a few people who feel that, I just haven't met them. And I think what I'm seeing is that, most AI and automation strategies focus on that mechanical layer without necessarily asking what happens to the analytical question underneath it. And that, I think, is a blind spot that we are collectively missing as a profession. So let's take an example of board minutes review. So this is one of those classic tasks that a lot of junior auditors will groan their way through on, well, thankfully not a very rainy Wednesday morning. But if we actually think about, what are we trying to achieve with a board minute review, we're not sitting there worrying about, well, were minutes actually taken of a meeting? Really what we're trying to work out is, get an understanding of how management thinks. We want to get an idea of, what is it that they're choosing to discuss? And I would say conspicuously, what are they not choosing to discuss? And that reveals a lot about, how they view the business, how they run it, and also what they consider their risks to be. You can play a similar game with the classic test of details. That's not really about date matching. If I've got an invoice dated 29th of December and the client's year end is the 31st of December, I'm less concerned about whether they've correctly recorded that invoice as relating to the 29th of December, and I'm more concerned about the cutoff risk and thinking, well, should this expense be recognized in this year, or, does it relate to next year, and therefore I should accrue it? And that's, one of the things that I think a lot of people outside the profession don't quite get. Because the auditor who blindly ticks that date without asking what the date means, they've not done any audit work. They've done the appearance of work, and they've got a lovely working paper that they can file away, but it's ultimately meaningless at the end of the day. And so, thinking about that as I was, pulling together this presentation, I was reminded of an interaction I had with one of our audit partners back during my ACA training contract years, a number of years ago. We were out on site in deepest, darkest Kent, working on a listed audit client, and a particularly tricky technical question came up to do with tax treatment and, how HMRC may view the way that the business was dealing with this particular solution. Very conveniently, this came up on the day of our partner review. And we ran through this in the morning with the partner, had to think about it, and we then had a debrief with the client just after lunch. And very happily, he talked the client through this process, gave a few suggestions, as if it were barely an inconvenience. And I sat there afterwards saying, how on earth did you come up with an answer so quickly that sounded so convincing? And he said, well, what a lot of people don't realize in the world of accountancy, a lot of it is about accumulating scenarios. So he'd been in the industry for about 25 years at that point, and he says over time, you tend to see most problems that clients can throw at you, one way or another. The principles are all there. So it's really just sort of having that memory bank that you can call on these things as and when needed, and look like you're the smartest guy in the room. Of course, when the client had gone later, he did then admit that actually he'd had almost the exact same question with a different client about 2 weeks prior, so he didn't have to go too far into the memory bank. But nonetheless, it still highlights that this is what that formation is. It's not a module, it's not a knowledge base, it's building that experience over time and actually applying these things in the real world. You can't necessarily replicate that experience and that knowledge by handing someone an AI summary and asking them to validate it. Because, much as we complain about AI and contextual awareness, if the human has no contextual awareness, well, does it really matter that you've got a human in the loop? So I'll pose a rhetorical question to you now. And just have a think about some of the tasks that your firm may have automated in the last year or two. Doesn't have to be that they used AI, it could be robotic process automation, it could even be a simple Excel macro to speed something along. And think, did that automation purely focus on the mechanical layer, or did it take something away from the analytical layer that is chipping away from something I would expect in order to be able to learn and build on an experience in their career? So I'll just give you sort of 30 seconds or so to think about that before we move on. So, irrespective of whether you came up with an answer to that question or not, you can think about it on the tube or train ride home later on today, or over the coming weeks. I think sort of what we've got on screen really summarizes some of the concerns here, that if we're in a scenario where AI is flagging the risk before a junior has even formulated the thought that there might be a risk, you haven't just automated that mechanical layer. You've automated, to an extent, the analytical layer too. Because that junior auditor is no longer asking the question. They're not even thinking that there needs to be a question to be asked. Instead, what they're doing is they're validating a suggestion, which means ultimately that one way or another, they are learning to confirm rather than to inquire. And that's a big difference. Over a career, I think if you focus more on the confirmation side of things, you could probably end up with a very competent technician. But I don't think you'd necessarily call them a particularly competent auditor. So, if that's the risk, and the risk being that if we've got the wrong tools being deployed at the wrong career stage, which potentially hollows out that analytical layer, how do we think about which tools belong where? And so, again, I've done my very simplistic approach of trying to come up with two sides of an argument here, and I've tried to group tools into two camps: deterministic and probabilistic. And so the idea here is to think about, well, what would you be happy giving to a year one auditor, or a day one auditor, someone like me who's got no idea on day one what an auditor actually does? Would you be happy giving them an incredibly powerful generative AI tool, or would you like something with some guardrails? Would you like, at least an audit supervisor, an audit manager to be sat there looking over their shoulder and sort of saying, no, you don't want to be doing that, hang on, calm down, before you really hurt yourself, let's crawl before we walk, and then walk before we run. So, deterministic tools. These tend to be centrally approved. They tend to be very repeatable because by nature they are deterministic. It's a relatively strict algorithm: if A, then B. And if you don't have A, then if you're lucky, you get a nice error message that you can understand. If not, you get some code gobbledygook that you end up coming to people in my team saying, the app's broken. So, no, it's stopping you from making a career-ending mistake. They have defined guardrails. And the output, crucially, doesn't depend on the experience of the person cranking the handle and running that tool. So that's something you can give to someone day one. How much damage could I do with a sample selection tool, for example? Hopefully very little. The other side of the screen, we have probabilistic tools, and this is where generative AI sits. Generative is the clue in the name there, where it's trying to create new content. And these are very powerful tools, don't get me wrong, but the overriding feature of these sorts of tools is that, unlike a deterministic tool, the quality of the output that you get out of a probabilistic tool is inherently tied to the quality of the input. And I'm sure you've all seen this in your workplaces. If we take Copilot as an example, the number of people who've no doubt said, oh, I tried to get Copilot to draft an email, or draft a findings report, or draft anything, and it gave me complete generic nonsense, absolute waste of time. Why are we spending so much on AI? And inevitably, when you ask to look at the prompt that they put in there, you tend to see something along the lines of draft an email. And so you think, okay, well, you gave it 3 words. Did it draft you an email? Well, yes, okay, so it met the brief. You didn't say what sort of an email, you didn't say who it was going to, what the key things you wanted to get across were, you didn't input any idea as to tone of voice, audience, any of that. And I'm pretty sure that if you turned to your day one auditor and said, draft me an email, you'd probably get something similar. Maybe if you were lucky, that day one auditor might have turned around and said, I think I need a little bit more to go on than just draft an email. But AI doesn't really do that. It likes to please you and give you a lovely answer coming out of it. So there's a real risk there. And really that context, that framing, that experience, the 25 years of accumulated scenarios that the audit partner referenced in my earlier example, that all builds into this. And I've sort of said year 3 potentially as a tool to give there on the basis that having completed your 3-year ACA qualification, I will freely admit that I was at my technical accounting peak at that point. Having recently passed my exams, I think it's all been downhill for me since then. Certainly the best tax audit work I ever did was in the month leading up to and after my actual tax ACA exams. Then you could pose any question at me, and I was just so hot on it. Now, not so much. If the answer's not 20%, is it really a tax? So ultimately, thinking about it, we're generally happy to give tools to our audit teams. But what sort of tools are we giving them? And can we really complain that much if we're giving them a tool that relies on a huge amount of experience that that auditor may not have, and then complaining about the quality of the work that we get out of it? Rhetorical question, but I think you can see where I'm going with the intended answer. And so if we're saying that these probabilistic generative tools are better suited to more experienced people, we tend to start thinking about audit partners, audit managers, directors, people leading these engagements. And if we're giving them these powerful tools that can save them some time and some effort, we're creating some space in their busy, busy lives. And we then have a follow-up question of, well, what do we do with that space that's being created? Do we lump a whole load more work onto them? Or do we say, you know what, let's actually get you guys having more conversations with your audit teams, with your clients. Let's get some more face time. Let's actually use some of this space that the automation's creating to have some genuine developmental conversations. Let's talk to our audit junior about, well, what the board minutes mean. Why is it that I'm having you read through all of these and pull together a working paper? What assertion are we trying to address in this test? Now, in an ideal world, we'd be having these conversations anyway, and sort of AI or no AI. I certainly learnt the most when I had supervisors out on site sitting down and saying, right, Konrad, this is why we actually care about this particular test. And suddenly things start to make sense. And you can then have more sensible conversations with your clients when you go back and say, well, hang on a second, that answer you gave me doesn't quite make sense when I play it all the way through. But crucially, these sorts of developmental conversations only happen if that manager or partner or supervisor makes it happen. It's very rare that you're going to have a young upstart junior auditor demanding that sort of developmental conversation. Because all it takes is one person to turn around and say, no, back in your lane. We need to get this audit over the line, and they're probably not going to ask the question again. And if we think about the joys of audit and pressured busy season, the path of least resistance inevitably is that the AI output starts to become the answer rather than necessarily the starting point or a discussion point. And to my mind, that's not a technology failure. That's a very human failure, and it's ultimately a leadership failure. And again, can happen with or without AI. So all of this going on in the background, all of these concerns about how we train people, how we develop them, in some cases how we get them through the door, is coming around quite a big change in the way that funding for the training in the profession has been altered since the start of this year. And it's not necessarily had as big of a debate as I think it should have warranted at the time. So, for those of you who are unaware, from the 1st of January of this year, Level 7 apprenticeship funding, which governs the master's level ACA route, was restricted by our glorious government to 16 to 21-year-olds only. Which is all well and dandy, until you realise that the average starting age of a Level 7 ICAEW apprentice is 22. And that's your typical graduate joiner that is now outside that normal funded cohort. And because the average age is 22, at least half of people now are outside this funding cohort with the way that averages work. And I'm not going to get into mean, mode, and median. But we had around 9,500 level 7 accounting and taxation starts in 2022-23. And so the majority of those would now be unfunded from this year onwards. Now, ICAEW, ACCA, CIPFA, and others all formally opposed this when it was originally mooted. And the government's response at the time was that, we really need to focus on school leavers getting people into work. So I'd say more so now than ever, particularly given some of the recent articles and findings suggesting that 1 in 5 people, young people, will be out of employment, education, and training in the next few years. But when you sort of start to unpick that sort of government pushback, you'll see that actually, school leavers entering the accountancy profession since 2017, which is when the levy was initially introduced, has doubled. So I'd say that those 16 to 21-year-olds are doing pretty well for themselves, without this change. And so the people that the government are trying to support are already well served. So what this actually does, as with all things, is it raises the direct cost of training graduate entry staff at the worst possible moment when we have all of these other competing interests and competing concerns. And crucially, because this is already in place, it's not a distant risk that we need to think about as part of a long-term strategy. It's a cost or a liability that you're already bearing to one extent or another, whether you know it or not. So if what I've said here has come as news, and you weren't aware of it before, I'd strongly recommend sort of going back to your firms, modeling this through, seeing what it actually means, and doing that sooner rather than later, so that you can actually start to come up with some strategies and work out how you can ultimately deal with that situation. And this leads me into the idea of, what will this do in terms of the professional services model? So because I'm a creative genius, I have come up with this glorious diagram to represent the traditional model of a pyramid, or triangle, because 3D shapes are far too difficult for me. This is a model that has served professional services, not just accountants, very well for well over a century. The idea being that you've got a lovely wide base of junior staff, and as they get more experience, you gradually taper to a select few senior leaders at the top. And generally speaking, the conversation in the market with the advent of AI, in particular AI agents, is about trying to move to something a little bit different, which, with the power of graphic design, can be represented as a diamond. So here we have fewer juniors, because a lot of the work that they have historically done has been replaced by AI agents. This is a far more pared down version of what the CEOs of OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft will have you believe, where frankly they want to get rid of the entire pyramid altogether and you just pay them a subscription fee. But we still have that wider experienced middle layer, and we're still tapering to those few partners. And this addresses quite a few issues. If you're in that unfortunate position where you're struggling to attract young talent into your firm, well, great, I'll just reduce the number of people I need to attract in the first place, problem solved. It is a solution that, in theory, scales quite nicely, and so on paper it's very, very attractive. But it does contain, well, a number of assumptions that haven't necessarily been examined as carefully as they could do. Because the middle layer that we've got of managers, supervising agents, and the few remaining staff that you may have, all of them came up through the current pyramid model. All of those people honed their judgment, refined their commercial instinct and their understanding of what good audit work is by doing the work that we're proposing the AI agents take over. So if you're hollowing out that junior cohort of today, you end up in a scenario, say in 2030, where the managers then are today's juniors who've inherently been formed and learned on the job differently. Because a lot of the stuff that they've done, well, they won't have done. They'll have validated, they'll have reviewed. And I'd argue that that's more than just a career progression problem, because how do you go from a very small point to a wide middle The maths just don't math at that point. So it becomes more than a career progression problem, and I would say turns into potentially a competence problem and a supervision problem. And this is something that's not necessarily going to be visible, for 5 years or so, by which point we'll be so in the thick of it that it'll be a lot harder to unwind and unpick some of the issues we may end up facing. And what you'll probably end up with, and this is me now going into my crystal ball gazing phase and doing a bit of my own doom mongering, so apologies, but you'll probably end up with going back to the pyramid again, because pyramids have been around in Egypt for so long. I'm sure the professional services pyramid will last just as long, where ultimately we have fewer people, shallower formation, same shape but smaller, just with a whole load of AI agents at the bottom. And so there's a reason I've then got question marks as to whether we need assistants, supervisors, assistant managers. Do today's managers get rebranded as assistants in the future? That'll be a fun career conversation to have, and certainly an interesting payroll discussion to have. But ultimately, if these AI agents are replacing our juniors of today, who's going to supervise those agents in 2030? And where did they learn how to supervise those agents and to pick up on incorrect work that's presented with incredible confidence? And I don't ask that because, I've got solutions to that. I don't. It's, a bit of a rhetorical question, but one that I think does bear consideration by the profession as a whole as we move forward into the ever-expanding brave new world. So, because I said we'd sort of try to think about building out a framework for how we can address some of this and what good might look like, I need to caveat this section by saying it's not a blueprint. RSM hasn't solved this, spoiler alert. I don't think anybody has. And just like any salesman, if anyone comes along saying that they have solved it, just pinch your fistful of salt to be thrown in their faces, please. But I've got 4 questions here that I think are worth everyone having a think about. Number 1, which tools, which career stage, and why? So most rollouts are driven by what's available, not what is necessarily developmentally appropriate. So firms that can't answer that first question of which tools belong at which career stage are not really implementing an AI strategy. You're running an experiment on your people without a control group, which is the worst kind of experiment you can possibly run. Question number 2, thinking about what happens to the analytical question that we posed about earlier. And that's a process design decision, not a technology one. And most firms aren't making that deliberately, and it's not one of those things that's just going to happen somehow and we'll muddle our way through it and everything will be sunshine and roses at the end of the process. That's very much putting your fate in the hands of the gods. And again, going back to classics, the gods of the ancient world were very capricious, so you really don't want to be doing that. Question 3, are your managers using the space that AI creates or just filling it with busy work? Because bear in mind that the ACA training contract is built on the concept of exposure. It's built on discussing work. It's built on getting feedback on that work and understanding. If AI is creating the space, we need to understand what managers are going to do with that space. And if you don't answer that question and set some direction, your firm's culture will answer it for you. And you may not necessarily be happy with the direction that answer takes. And finally, are you using AI to develop your experienced practitioners? So again, the managers, the directors, the partners. Because generative AI scales with experience. Are they using it to stress test their thinking? Are they preparing for difficult conversations? And it's something that's worth developing deliberately and not leaving to chance. Because you will have mad people like me who will try any shiny new toy under the sun and will probably spend far too much time playing around with it, but the majority of people adopt a wait-and-see attitude. You need to push them, as with any technology adoption. So, I want to just pause on this particular quote that, with impeccable timing, came out as I was pulling together the first draft of this presentation. So, to set the scene, I had an audit team reach out to me on a Friday lunchtime saying that they were trying to use one of our revenue analytics tools and it wasn't working. Huge number of outliers, busy season pressure mounting, lots of pressure from the client to just do it the old-fashioned way, we'll tick our way through hundreds of samples, this is ridiculous if the technology doesn't work. So jumped on a call with a colleague of mine from the app development team, and we spent half an hour with the audit team working through the client's business, the specific problem that we're encountering, and very long story short, we found the answer and worked out what the audit team needed to do to resolve it, which ultimately ended up with a minuscule sample of outliers they needed to test. But as we were closing the call, the audit manager said, that was really helpful, thank you very much. Apologies for wasting your time. I know you're a busy person, you've got better things to do. And before I could do my usual sort of, oh, no, this is exactly what I'm here to do, the audit partner spoke up and said, actually, no, this has been a fantastic use of our time. We've all sat down as a team and we spent half an hour really understanding this section of the client's business and how they run various revenue streams. Without this tool and the errors we found trying to use it, we'd never have done this. And I think we've all massively benefited, not just for this audit, but for future audits. So the takeaway for me, in a bit of a LinkedIn GenAI post type way, was that the tool didn't fail. It created the conditions for a conversation that built understanding and that actually built better quality audit work. And what made it work was the partner who recognized that the conversation we were having itself was more of the value than the actual tool. And importantly for me, that's a cultural piece that, unfortunately, you can't ship as a software update. So, we're coming to the end, don't worry. You don't have to listen to me too much longer. I've got on screen 4 questions there, which you may want to take back to your firm. I say may, I'd strongly recommend you take back as many as you can to your firm, but your mileage will vary. And really thinking about, what I've been speaking about here. Does your AI strategy have a talent development chapter? Which tools belong at which career stage? And I'd say most importantly, why? That's the real question you want to answer there. Are our managers using the space that AI creates, or are they just filling it with busy work? And if they're filling it with busy work, maybe they can use AI to automate that and recreate the space again. And then finally, who supervises our agents in 2030, and how do they learn how to do it? So, I started the session by asking how many of you have a talent development chapter in your AI strategy. I'm not going to rehash that question, don't worry. But I will take it as read that your AI strategy probably has a technology chapter. It probably has a quality chapter. It'll have a risk chapter, and it may have a regulatory chapter, and a change management chapter, and possibly a client communication chapter. Does it have a talent development chapter? And if so, who's writing it, and when? So with that, you'll be glad to hear that's the end of the formal structured element of this presentation. And we can get into the fun Q&A, although Q&A suggests that I have answers to your questions. So we can have an extended discussion, if you will, on that front. As it says on screen, you've got a QR code for a survey, so fill it in now, fill it in later, entirely up to you. But yes, with that, I will hand over to you to throw any questions, thoughts, comments, queries, and yeah, I'd like to see where we can take the discussion. So, over to you. So this is a bit where I have to put on the headphones as well.
Thanks, Konrad. That was very good. But did I miss the bit where you answered question 4?
Question 4.
So your little pyramid sitting on top of the AI. How do we have the lowest level of our rungs be managers?
This one here.
Yeah, and then in your summary, who's going to be monitoring the AI in 2030, and how do we train them?
Well, that's very much sort of the rhetorical question that I'll admit I don't have the answer to at this particular point in time. This is sort of one of those things where I think is almost a natural end point of where some of the conversations that are being had in the marketplace are taking us. I don't necessarily think that this is what professional services firms want or should want. I think this is absolutely what the big AI labs would quite like, because there's an awful lot of revenue in AI agents. The move that we've had over the years, if I take Microsoft as an example, in days gone, you used to pay for your Microsoft Office licenses, they were locally installed, and sort of that was it. Every 3-4 years, Microsoft would release another update, and hopefully people would pay more money, upgrade for the new features. That's gone with Office 365, the move to subscriptions. So inevitably, there's this move from the big technology companies to try to, monetize that as much as they possibly can. So to my mind, I'd rail against this a bit. I don't think we're going to necessarily end up with a pyramid as we currently see it. We may end up with something that's a bit more oblong, potentially a bit taller, or if I sort of really go off the deep end and get overly excited by some of the things that the Bryden review is coming up with, I think you may end up with a streaming of the audit profession into different sort of sector specialists and subgroups, where you may end up with an augmented AI specialist auditor that focuses on X, Y, and Z, in a similar way to what firms are doing with looking at IT controls with Audit Data Analytics, for example. So yes, not really a cast iron answer, I'm afraid, on that front, but certainly a question that I think is worth thinking about, because the answer is inherently going to be different for each firm. What works for RSM is going to be something very different to what works for a smaller firm or even for a larger firm. Some of the stuff that the Big Four are doing, I look at and think, gosh, if I had just a fraction of that budget, imagine what I could do. So it's a very personal piece that I think I don't want to sit here as some sort of all-seeing oracle and tell you thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, because for 99% of people, it's not going to work. Good. Another question over there.
Thank you, Konrad. You said that we should think about which tool we make available for which grade in the organization. What I experience at the moment, we should make tools available just for the junior stuff. Do you have an example for a tool that you make available for partner and director level, and why?
So I don't necessarily think it's a case of you'd have different tools. I think you may have some of the same tools, but we'll have different use cases. So, the classic tool that I know is dunked on and hated on a bit is Copilot. And, there are some things that Copilot does that are more helpful for more senior people in the firm. So, I was actually demoing to our head of audit yesterday some of the things that Copilot could do these days, where I just said, okay, well, summarize my emails, prioritize them in order for me, what should I focus on first? Unbeknownst to me, he had, whilst I was explaining that Copilot could do this, sent me an email which just simply had in the header, answer me now. Thankfully, Copilot put that up to the top, which pleased him greatly, until I pointed out that I had a system prompt in the back end that said, well, anything that comes from head of audit, don't care what it is, that goes to the top of the list, being my boss's boss's boss. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Copilot. So I've had other discussions with senior members within the firm, just off the back of conversations where they've sort of made a comment around, oh, I'm going to have to spend ages trying to find time for a meeting that X number of people can attend. At which point I've jumped in and said, okay, right, forget about that. Open up Outlook. How long is your meeting going to be for? Oh, 40 minutes. Right. Put in 40 minutes into Outlook now, just any space you've got. Add in all the people you want to invite and hit the schedule button. This isn't AI. This is just core functionality within Outlook that's been there for at least 10, if not more years. So I think there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit out there that we need to remind people about. Because it's all very well when you release something, just throw it out there, see what happens. Hopefully people will pick it up and they'll run with it. Some will. Most won't, because they don't see it as directly relevant to some of the day-to-day work that they do. The concept of using it to draft emails. I'll admit that when Copilot originally came out and we rolled it out across the firm, I hated it. I thought it was awful. I thought it was incredibly American, very cloying, and it has improved over time. But I've also been using AI tools for the last 2 years, so I've become used to the way that I need to prompt it. I've built up my own system prompts so that I've effectively got a 4 or 5 page system prompt in the back end of Copilot that says, right, this is me, this is what I do in my team, these are my priorities, this is the tone I want in everything I do. So now some of those email drafts, I still wouldn't send them straight off, but they're a heck of a lot better than they used to be, and that saves me time. And I know for senior people, that will save them time as well. So don't necessarily think that these tools need to focus purely on the audit side of things, because there will be purely audit tools that are absolutely fantastic that junior team members will use. Audit partners, audit managers probably don't really care about those tools. They care about the outputs of those tools and how easy it is to review and understand what their junior auditor has done and is presented to them. So if you almost think of it as a sort of audit work tool set and audit management or life management tool set, then you'll probably start to have some more interesting discussions with some of those senior stakeholders who may be in the camp of, oh, AI is rubbish and it doesn't help me. Hopefully that answers the question. Good. Another question at the back there.
Jess, hi. Bit of an extension on the first question and more just be interested to get your opinion on this.
All dangerous things, opinions.
In terms of AI and the more junior staff, so like graduates and new members coming into the organisation, I'm sure many of us here from a financial perspective have done ACA, ACCA qualifications like that. Do you think we'll get to a stage where firms should or will start telling more junior staff to do qualifications that they'll have to do to help them in their career, similar to an ACA? And do you think that'll help them, not just the individual, but the firms to progress forwards as well with the AI kind of, importance coming into the firms and organisations and industries?
So is that, sorry, I'm going to play the question back to you a little bit there. So is that the question more, are we going to replace the ACA or are we going to supplement it with something else?
No, so not replacing it, because we're going to always need them qualifications, but mandating AI qualifications and giving them the same level of importance that we do to other qualifications that we have in the financial services industry.
Okay, fair enough. That's a really interesting question. And actually, the reason I say that it's interesting is that when I talk to our engineering teams, our software development teams within the firm, there are very few formalized qualifications in that world. You tend to build up an experience bank, you build up a portfolio of, well, this is the sort of stuff I played around with Python or SQL or Rust if you're, really mad. If you see a lot of sort of devs working together, at the start of a project, a lot of the time you will see that they'll huddle together and they'll work out, well, what are we trying to achieve? What do we think is the best way to approach this? And then irrespective of anyone's seniority or position, they will say, okay, we think this is the right tool set that we should use. Who's got the most experience in this tool set? And I don't care whether you've been working here for 30 years or whether you've been here for 6 months. If you've got the most experience, you take point and away you go. So I'm always a little bit reluctant to go too hard on the qualifications route. There's certainly an element of foundational basics that I think can't hurt anyone. Whether you necessarily need to formalize those, I'm not entirely sure. And particularly if we think about generative AI, I mentioned that I hated Copilot 2 years ago when it came out. I'm not saying I'm in love with it now, but I do see its uses. I still think Claude is better, but each to their own. The pace of change just seems to keep on accelerating and keep on moving. You can come up with a lovely training program, a lovely sort of set of qualifications that does exactly what you need to do right now. And that's if you sort of pull together that piece quickly. There have absolutely been times as we've been developing a new app or tool, we're actually halfway through development, you realize, oh, actually, this thing has come out, we've now got this ability, scrap this, start again, and build something better. That's always a risk with all of these solutions. I would imagine that you'll see more and more of these sorts of things coming into the new ACA. So I see Ian Pay from ICAEW is here in the front, so feel free to talk to him about ACA and what the new qualification route there looks like. But to my mind, a lot of this technological adoption, a lot of this tool adoption is akin to water wearing away a stone. You need to keep on reminding people that these things exist. You need to keep on sitting down there, being available to support them. You know, having a remote support function doesn't really do anything. We've found at RSM that the best way of getting something rolled out and adopted is, you know, literally saying, call me anytime. You know, find me on Teams, send me a chat, drop me an email. Probably not an email because those get buried in an inbox, but Teams I tend to respond to quite quickly. You know, if it's an AI-related question, I've got Ryan, who's in the audience over there. Talk to him. If it's an app-related question, talk to Jack. If it's bespoke, talk to Drew and others in the team. So it's, I think, more about building that culture and fostering that culture for experimentation, being afraid to get things wrong. Because we all get things wrong, and that's the best way of learning. I'm always a bit terrified of people who seem to have never failed at anything in life, because imagine what happens when they do fail for the first time. Did that answer the question appropriately for you? Good.
Thank you. I think one of the elements of the tenant development chapter that you mentioned is what are you going to do with the time the AI is going to free up? And are you going to spend it on value-adding analysis and conversations? Can you give us some examples that perhaps you're seeing within RSM on how you are institutionalizing those kind of activities? How do you make sure it happens? What does that strategy look like?
Yes, that's the really tricky thing of institutionalizing it, because every single team is different, every client is different. You know, I recall assisting one of our pensions partners in a tender a few years ago, admittedly before the big AI boom came along, and Deloitte were up in front of us, went through a very whiz-bang presentation, lots of graphics, very beautifully put together. You know, as a data nerd, I thought this is sexy. The audit committee sort of, you know, ran through what they wanted to with them, and sort of then came to us. And when Deloitte had left the room, the head of the audit committee said that he was really disappointed in Deloitte's presentation because he was after an auditor who would do the job in the most efficient way possible, and they didn't need someone to be coming in and trying to give them a whole load of management information and trying to tell them how to sort of run their particular aspect of the business. So I thought, okay, right, let's not make any assumptions here about what people want. And I'm sure, you know, you'll come across in your own client base that there'll be some clients that are more open to these sorts of discussions, some clients that are more, no, I just want the audit opinion. There's a question as to how long you want to work with those sorts of clients. But, you know, when it comes to institutionalizing this, back to your question, you're going to need to come up with a different strategy for the different partners and the different leaders that you've got in your business. So we have some partners who are ex-Big Four, who've joined the business and view a lot of this sort of technological stuff as just, well, this is just, you know, part of the course. This is what we should be doing, and I don't care if the firm hasn't mandated anything. I'm mandating the use of these tools on my audits. And those audit teams that work on those audits are forced to use the tools. And yes, there may be some resistance initially, but they eventually sort of get to the point where they realize, oh, actually, this is saving me a bit of time and it's making my life a bit easier. Maybe I'll suggest this on the next audit, you know, with a different partner. And so, you know, we found that different offices around the firm sort of pick these things up in different ways. So for a long time, I used to really annoy our partners in the Northeast and Northwest by saying, well, look at Hull. Look at that office and their adoption of all of these tools. They are far outpacing you on every conceivable metric that I've got here in terms of raw use, average, you know, number of runs per person, you know, whatever it is. You know, there's no way you can fiddle the numbers so that Manchester somehow comes out better, or Newcastle comes out better, or, you know, Glasgow, or whatever it is. And that encouraged a bit of competition. Now, I knew that the regional audit managing partner who's based out of Manchester sort of views that Manchester is best. So what then followed was effectively a year program that he instigated himself to proto-mandate a whole load of these tools. He would push back on any audit partners within the office. He said, oh, no, I'm not using that. It doesn't work. Really? Have you tried? I'd love to see the reason why it didn't work. And oddly enough, we started to see adoption take off a bit there. And even when you roll something out new, so I remember, conscious of, I just hit the red zone on the time, I recall when we rolled out our journals testing app about 5 years ago, the amount of pushback we got from audit teams and certain partners saying, oh, this is going to add hours to the work that we have to do. It's really unintuitive, really don't like it, Konrad, this is an absolute disaster. We mandated that. That's the only app that's mandated within RSM. Within 6 months, some of those exact same partners were then coming back to me and saying, I don't suppose you could update the app to also do this, this, and this. So sometimes, you know, you need to force people to get with the game. Sometimes it's a bit of, you know, catching more flies with honey than vinegar. But everyone's different and everyone's approach is different. So it's probably a bit of a rubbish answer, I'm afraid. But that's been my experience. And I'm afraid probably with 5 seconds to go, I'm not allowed to take any more questions. But thank you very much for listening and for the interaction.